Hello, my name is Clay Boykin, and I am in search of the new compassionate male. I believe in the midst of these incredible times of change, a new compassionate male is emerging as the new archetype, and this podcast is intended to give voice to both men and women on the overarching topic of compassion consciousness in men.
The feminist critique of patriarchy, especially the radical feminist critique that I've worked with now for more than 3 decades, which is routinely understood by men to be a threat, is in fact not a threat. It is a gift to us. An increasing number of men, especially young men, are reporting that their early experiences with sexuality have been so tied to pornography that they simply cannot function sexually without thinking about pornography. And he said, it's like a porn loop is always running in my head. And he said, the only way I can have sex with my girlfriend is to keep that porn loop running.
A short while ago, my producer, Dennis Tardan, and I had the opportunity to have a discussion with Robert Jensen. Robert is the author of the book, The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. In this eye-opening episode, we discuss patriarchy and pornography. A warning, this episode uses sexually explicit language. Let's join that conversation.
Hello world, it's me, Dennis, and we are in search of the new compassionate male. I'm the producer of this podcast, and I'm here with the founder of the movement, Clay Boykin. Hello, Clay.
Hi, Dennis. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderfully. Introduce our guest today.
Robert and I have met one time in a row. We met back in August of 2019, and it was a mutual friend. Yes. And I think the first thing that Robert said was, why are we meeting? And I said, well, that's why I'm here. I'm going to learn why we're meeting.
Well, thank you, Dennis. Thanks, Clay. Great to be here.
It's wonderful to see you, Robert, because I was the thing about what is happening now in the world is, or what I'm seeing and what Clay is seeing in our journey to in search of the new compassionate male is that the world is way overbalanced, over masculine and under feminine in so many, in my perception, and that this imbalance has caused, especially when we're getting into the quantum consciousness and the quantum world, that there's so much complexity and so much emergence that needs to happen, that can only happen when we deal with the patriarchy head on. Mm-hmm. And so that was one of the reasons why I was so excited about being here with you, because this is I see the patriarchy as wounding us all.
I think I would use somewhat different language, that the world is too hierarchical, that the hierarchical overwhelms the egalitarian. And it's good to, I think, to recognize that at the core of that, from my point of view, is patriarchy. That is within the human family, the oldest system of hierarchy there is. It goes back 5,000-6,000 years, maybe. And that long evolutionary history is important. In some sense, we don't need the new compassionate male. We need to get back to what male and female meant before the emergence of those hierarchies, millennia ago.
Like a re-emergence.
Yeah, but it's new to us, so new is perfectly fine. So I sometimes get a little uncomfortable with the masculine, feminine dichotomy. Certainly male and female are quite different, biologically, physiologically, please. Right? But I'm cautious about generating notions of masculine and feminine that go beyond what we really can know. Most of human psychology is a mystery. We don't really understand ourselves either as individuals or as a species. And I think that I don't want to harden masculine and feminism. Now, the reality of patriarchy, of course, is that male and female now mean very different things.
Yes.
And as you point out, patriarchy, if we step back, isn't really in the long-term human self-interests of anyone. Now, of course, we have to recognize that the injuries both psychological and physiological, visited upon women and girls are far more extensive, more brutal than the injuries visited upon boys and men. It doesn't mean boys and men get out without injury, but I always also want to avoid any false equivalency about what the effects of patriarchy are. But that said, one of the things that I say over and over again, as often as possible, is that the feminist critique of patriarchy, especially the radical feminist critique that I've worked with now for more than 3 decades, which is routinely understood by men to be a threat, is in fact not a threat. It is a gift to us. And so, you know, my bumper sticker line is radical feminism is a gift to men, because while not obscuring the damage done to women and girls in patriarchy, it helps men understand how there is a different way of living, and from my point of view, a far richer, deeper, and more simply pleasurable way of living than anything patriarchy offers us. Patriarchy does offer short-term material advantages to men.
Exactly.
But, you know, just like white supremacy offers short-term material advantages to white people, or being an American citizen has short-term material self-interest. But is that how we want to define ourselves? By our short-term material self-interest, or does being human mean something else? And it's that something else that we have to be willing to struggle for.
Beautifully said. Because I think about this rock at the edge of the Milky Way in the solar system, and the idea of the separation of us as species, as seeing us as anything else but all part of an organic whole, is absurd. We're all together on this. We're all, and whatever separates us, there has to be something. And I love the way you phrased that about the short-term gains, the sugar high that I can get from the patriarchy or from living in a hierarchical sense, completely obliterates my ability to see the richness that you're talking about, this unexplored country, this opportunity for us to do. How do we, how are you both modeling and how are you expressing the value of this to someone who has never experienced it?
Well, I can talk real briefly, and then I'm interested in Clay's response about the primary work I've done around men's use of pornography, and by extension also what I call the other sexual exploitation industries: prostitution, stripping, massage parlors. These are the ways that men routinely buy and sell objectified female bodies for sexual pleasure. Okay. Now, most men, especially men in what I would call the post-Playboy era, you know, I was born in 1958. I'm part of that generation. Most of us have some experience with using pornography, graphic, sexually explicit material. That's true of both straight and gay men. The radical feminist critique of pornography that I discovered when I was about 30 years old was really important, because it was a demonstration of that principle that a feminist critique of patriarchy is in the interest not only of women and girls, but men and boys as well. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is not only analyze in a kind of detached, objective fashion, and I think detached, objective analysis is sometimes very important, but to also talk about why it's meaningful to me, why I cared about the issue in the first place, and what answers I found to my own struggles. Now, that means I have to talk about myself, and sometimes that's uncomfortable. Sometimes it feels a bit self-aggrandizing to be talking about yourself. But one of the things, of course, we know that men are socialized to bury emotions, to especially bury uncomfortable emotions, to always show strength. We all know the sort of profile of traditional masculinity. And so you have to break that not only with analysis, but with, you know, modeling some other way. And so I talk about growing up, my use of pornography, how it never felt right, how I was both drawn to it and scared of it. You know, all the things that boys and men growing up typically experience about pornography, and why discovering a radical feminist critique of that particular form of sexual exploitation was not only compelling in a sort of philosophical and political way, but opened up a whole new world for me, a different way to understand myself, to be a sexual being. And that, has been a 30-year process. And I'm not sure I'm ever any closer to figuring it all out, but I'm certainly in a place where I've been able to leave behind some of that, the anxiety, the depression, the sense of a detachment from my own body and my own psyche that came with use of pornography. And I talk about that in public because I think, especially boys and young men need to hear that one can do that in public as a guy. And so that's a lot of my work. It's both melding the kind of the research I do and the writing with a kind of different way of being in public than most of us who are men have been socialized into.
I want to pick up on what you were saying, about the anxiety and depression, and add to that the fear and the shame, and then the expectation of what we are supposed to be as men in our society and our culture, what we're expected to do. And there's such a division in that. I work with an organization called Gender Equity and Reconciliation International. And one of the things that comes up in there, we do address the pornography industry and the objectification both ways. And the biggest thing is the recognition that both women and men are wounded on a broad sense through the patriarchy. Again, not to say they're equal and not to compare somebody's wounds, but to recognize that we're all wounded and use that as a basis to begin to heal.
I agree completely. And it reminds me of it's a quip that is now so iconic that I have a hard time remembering the woman who first said it. But she said, men are afraid that women might laugh at them, right? The fear that they're not man enough. He said, women are afraid men will kill us. And that really encapsulates the difference between living male and female in the culture. But I think you're absolutely right. It shouldn't obscure the fact that men suffer. And here I think, not to be too much of a nerdy, academic type, but we have to think about what are the systems that generate men's suffering. Well, for men of color, one of them is white supremacy, that the suffering of men there is directly tied to another system of power, right? For poor and working class men, it's often capitalism that is the source of that suffering, that sense of anxiety and shame and inadequacy. But patriarchy is a source of men's suffering too. So let me just make this very concrete, because as I said, I think being honest about our own experience is important. Today, I'm a fairly normal-sized American male, but when I grew up, I was always the shortest kid in the class. I was the skinniest kid in the class. I was the weakest kid in the class. I was the classic, kid walking around with a target on his back that said, bully me, and I was terrified as a kid for all sorts of reasons. Right? Now, what's the source of that pain? Well, it's patriarchy. It's the way men in patriarchy are trained not only to dominate women, but to dominate each other. So the solution to my problem, my pain as a man, isn't to say, well, those feminists only care about women. It's to say, oh, feminism analyzes a very destructive system of power based on the male-female distinction. And not only women suffer in it, but especially weak and vulnerable men suffer as well. But then I would take it another step, which is, growing up, I always thought, take the high school quarterback, the ultimate expression of, dominant masculinity that we grew up with, whatever it was. I always thought they had it made. I looked at them and I thought, oh God, they're strong, they're confident, that all the women love them, all the men love them, everybody loves them, And I realized as I got older and started talking to men, both in formal research projects and informally, that virtually every man I have ever met at some point it's funny. You never know when you're going to get hit with emotion. And this one just made me tear up. But every man I've ever talked to at some point in his life felt like he wasn't man enough, that he didn't meet the expectation. Even the high school quarterback, I would venture to say, even Donald Trump at some point, probably every day, worries he's not man enough, And so all of those things are true. It doesn't obscure the threat that men pose to women and girls. That's true enough. But this other complexity is not only important for us as men to live, meaningful lives. It's important so that we become less of a threat to women. And when you add that up with white supremacy and capitalism and, U.S. It's a lot to untangle. And I think that's part of why traditional notions of masculinity are so persuasive to some people, because they're simple. They say, here is either the natural order or the God-given order, man on top, women on bottom, right? And when you're struggling with all of this, both emotional and intellectual turmoil, simple answers, we see that over and over again. Simple answers are easy answers.
Absolutely.
But they don't really speak to our heart. That's the problem.
When we label, when we sit down and we're talking about where do we go from here, I'm trying to understand. When I was growing up, there was such an ability to search out and find something that was titillating. Because I'm 73, you could find a calendar with cleavage, or you would find, so this was, and so I was gradually introduced into, and then suddenly that you would find a men's magazine, you would find a bare breast. Then later on, so my trip was a gradual way into, all the way into hardcore pornography, but it was over a stretch of time, from in the 1950s, over a stretch of time there was this crash. And I'm trying to then put myself into the mind of an 11 or 12-year-old that goes immediately from zero to anything. And I just don't see how. I do not understand what happens in the brains of that 11 and 12-year-old male. I'm just talking about, just because that would have been that does that has absolute total access, the complete to anything. When that was my gradual, and that came with a challenge in that my sexuality was hooked into shame, hiding. So so that when it was hiding, it was more titillating than when it was open.
Well, and
so there's a decoupling that I've had to work through to decouple that, so that it wasn't just that it isn't that is the stimulant.
As you're talking about that gradual climb, it's the frog in the pot of water. He doesn't realize that it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter until finally it breaks.
But when you talk to young boys today, when they are, the internet is right there. It's free, it's open. How what insights can you give us? What are they going?
Well, I think you're identifying a problem, and it's a problem that the culture largely will not deal with. I often think of my friend Gail Dines, who's probably now the leading feminist anti-pornography critic in the US. She runs a great group called Culture Reframed. And Gail and I have been working together for almost 30 years now. And Gail says we've been running an unregulated social experiment on our children, especially on boys, by exposing them to easily accessible hardcore pornography with no control, right? And somewhere down the line, we're going to see what the effects of that are. But I think we can already see effects that should lead us to be concerned. So here's the anecdote I offer that I think sums it up. I was reading an article in which a sex educator at an American university said that one of the things she's counseling young men, so imagine an 18-year-old boy, coming to college, dating, and she says, for heterosexual men, I tell them, on a first date, don't try to choke your partner, don't immediately ask for anal sex, and don't ejaculate on their face. Okay, now let's stop for a minute. In what world would it be the first assumption of an 18-year-old boy who's emerging sexually to choke a female partner during sex, to immediately demand anal sex, or to immediately decide that ejaculating onto her face is pleasurable? Well, it's pretty clear where those ideas come from. Those are routine sexual situations in pornography.
Yeah.
Now, they're what I call pornographic sex. Now, they're real sexual acts that real human beings engage in, but they are largely limited to the pornography world. Now, by that, I don't mean there isn't individual variation in human sexuality. I mean, human beings try a lot of different things sexually.
Certainly.
But we can see patterns now where acts like that are coming directly from pornography. So we can see that it's not a simple case, as it never is in human media consumption, that an individual sees a media representation and immediately goes out like a robot and enacts that practice. It's not that simple.
It isn't that simple, and it can't be, because we look across the culture. There must be a huge cohort of men who have been of young men who have exposed to this and are now going into their normal relationship, and they're not going out there.
Right.
So that I'm curious about them.
Yeah. But that's true of all media consumption, that other factors interact with the media consumption, and individual behavior will vary. So take, the example I would use is take advertising. If you watch a Coca-Cola advertisement, you don't walk out like a robot and buy Coca-Cola.
Right.
Yet Coca-Cola and other American corporation spends hundreds of billions of dollars a year on advertising. Right? In other words, they don't know which person is going to be motivated to consume a product because of the advertising, but they know on average that the more they spend on advertising, the more product sales will go up. Well, that's something we've known about human behavior in a mass-mediated society for a long time, that other factors, interact. So you can show me 100 Coca-Cola ads, and at this point in my life, I will never go buy a Coca-Cola again, because for other reasons, I don't want it. But it will increase Coca-Cola consumption. Okay, so that's just the way media operate, But what we're talking about now in the world of pornography, as you pointed out, is unprecedented access by people of all ages, not just adults, to unprecedentedly brutal material. That is, the actual content of pornography is more cruel and degrading to women than ever before. And by the way, more overtly racist as well, right? And that there are virtually no controls on the use of this material, including by young people. Now, we focus so far on the effects on boys. It's also increasing, although men and boys are the primary target audience for the pornography industry. Women are using pornography at higher rates and also reporting effects. So let's get back to your first question. What effect does that have? Well, it shapes ideas about what is appropriate sexual behavior, but it also has another psychological effect that we're seeing, in which increasingly I'm hearing, as I'm talking to groups about this and involved with various organizing efforts, that an increasing number of men, especially young men, are reporting that their early experiences with sexuality have been so tied to pornography that they simply cannot function sexually without thinking about pornography. The first time this came to me was when a young man came up after a talk, and this was now 20 years ago, and he said, it's like a porn loop is always running in my head. And he said, the only way I can have sex with my girlfriend is to keep that porn loop running. Because his own arousal patterns have been so conditioned to that over such a long time.
Totally.
right? Now, the flip side of, or the other side of that is that men become so conditioned to sexual activity, to pornography, that they simply cannot interact sexually with real women. There's actually a term for this now called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. So men in their 20s, I've talked to a number of these men, and the data is now, adding up. Men who have no physiological problems that should lead to erectile dysfunction. They're completely healthy, who cannot achieve or maintain an erection in a sexual interaction. These are mostly heterosexual guys, in a sexual interaction with a real woman, because their sexuality is so keyed to that porn, that without porn, they simply cannot perform. Now, you talk about emotionally devastating. You're young, you're forming your own idea of yourself as a person, as a sexual being, and you are in this addictive-like cycle of using pornography. You can see that it's destroying your ability not only to be sexual, but to have a real intimate relationship with someone you may love in the real world. Well, that's a desperate place to be. And the good news is a lot of these men are organizing, often online, to share stories, to provide support. I think there are more and more therapists that are open to the idea that this kind of habitual pornography use, which some people would call an addiction, I think that's a reasonable claim. We talk about addictions to gambling, to extreme sports, to other behavioral things. Addiction is not just to drugs and alcohol.
Well, of course not.
But I'll let the psychologists debate whether it's a real addiction or not. The point is that men form these habitual patterns of use, which they cannot break with. I can't count the number of men who said, I wish I could stop. I pledged to myself I'm going to stop.
Absolutely.
And then I'm right back in front of the computer.
In the same way that we are right back in front of the refrigerator, or right back in front of the pantry, as much as we've pledged ourselves to do that. All right, can you take us back, Bob, to the macro level? Okay, how do we as a society in our system begin to address this?
Well, I think the first and most obvious step is we chain our children in the basement until they're about 18 years old.
Thank you. Okay. Problem solved. Thank you. I knew we would come to. We would come to it. All right. Perfect.
Okay. Well, this is, I think, your question hints at why people are so afraid of talking about it. I have a lot of folks who do parent education on this issue. It's not just reaching out to children, to boys, girls, young men, and young women. Parents are obviously a place where education goes on alongside with schools and churches and all the other institutions. And what I hear is that parents are terrified precisely because they don't know what to do. You can't, unless you want to, take dramatic steps to cut off your child's access to a mobile phone, to a computer.
And if you think that would help, if you think that they can't go next door,
right,
we can't do, that is a fool's errand.
And so what parental education and age-appropriate education for kids is really important. So is that a solution? Well, it's not going to solve the problem overnight. The next step would be, do we need legislation? Well, I do think public policy would help curb the problem, but then what kind of policy? We know that kind of a regressive censorship rarely fixes problems like this. This is one of those,
actually the opposite direction sometimes.
It can be the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes, people distinguish between problems and wicked problems. Problems are things we can imagine solving. Wicked problems sometimes seem insoluble. Now, I do think if you want to go back again to that macro and think about the politics of feminism as well, the original critics of pornography from the feminist perspective, this goes back to the late 70s, the early 80s, they did have some innovative ideas about how to move from censorship and sort of state repression to a more civil rights approach that would allow women, both women in general and women in the pornography industry, to bring civil actions to address harms. Well, there's a long story about the ins and outs of the legal system and interpretations of the First Amendment. The conclusion is that that proposal, which I thought was compelling in many ways, it failed. And I do think we could resurrect parts of it and try again. But I think, some combination of education and public policy can help. But, it's kind of, you made an analogy to our consumption of unhealthy food, right? It's a kind of industrial eating, as
Sure.
the novelist Wendell Berry once said, right? That's, in a sense, I think a good way to think about pornography. It's like industrial sex. And when you have a whole industry that's dedicated to generating extraordinary profits from industrial eating or industrial sex, you don't break those industries easily. And so, we're talking about, not only the gender system, we're talking about the economic system, we're talking about a world that is largely mass mediated today, and often, especially young people's primary experience with the world is through some sort of media device.
Exactly.
Which is
collecting. When you were talking about Coca-Cola knows that you're not its market.
Yeah.
It is tailoring its ads not to you. It's tailoring its ads to others now. I mean, and it's getting more and more so. So even on your TV screen, the thing that people are able to target the media to what you're doing. If we cannot legislatively talk about sex education, if this is so verboten within our legislature that when the legislative committees say, no, this is the parents' responsibility, this is not something that we can bring in to the educational system, we cannot do that, that concerns me.
Absolutely. And this points to the complexity of the politics of pornography, because the two primary critics of pornography come from either this radical feminist perspective or a pretty right-wing, typically Christian or other religiously based perspective.
Exactly.
Now, I don't come from that right-wing Christian background. I know that in my interactions with some people who do, there can be very productive engagements. I think one of the successes of radical feminism is it has helped some, especially the women in the conservative anti-pornography movement, see the bigger picture of injuries to women and girls, and that's all to the good. I'm not sure the men in the anti-pornography movement from conservative perspectives have learned the same lesson. But there are real differences there as well. And you pointed out one of them, that pornography is essentially the de facto sex education for a huge percentage of American children today. And when the schools are not providing that sex education, when the churches, another vehicle for education, largely ignore it, and when parents are often too afraid to bring it up, that leaves the terrain open to pornography to define what is normal sexuality.
Exactly.
And if you are, as you pointed out, 11 years old is not particularly early for people's exposure to porn.
Not in the least.
There are different surveys you can find, but let's say the average age of first exposure to pornography for a boy is somewhere between 11 and 14.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at 11 and 14, you are not a fully developed sexual being.
Nor is the brain and the kinds of judgmental that do not even get wired.
Right. So when pornography is the only source of information about sexuality, then we're in trouble. Now, I want to point out that, I've been talking about a feminist critique, but not all women in feminism share this critique. There are a lot of different perspectives on pornography, some that even celebrate pornography. People who take the position I do, working out of that radical feminist critique, are sometimes accused of, engaging in a moral panic. That's a term. And not to digress too much into obscure media history, but almost every new media form has come with fear, right? Radio, television, all these things The one I'm always most fond of is comic books. When comic books started appearing, there was a critique that comic books would corrupt young people.
Absolutely.
Well, there was a moral panic. Okay, so the fact that there's a history of people being afraid of media technologies doesn't mean that there's no fear of media technologies that's warranted, right? Think about television. Television did change the way many of us interacted with the natural world, and not all for the better. So was there a moral panic about television? Well, maybe, but it turned out some of that critique was quite accurate, right? The concerns about, living online. It's not a moral panic. It's an awareness that technology fundamentally changes not only our relationship to each other, but our relationship to the larger living world. And some of those changes have been negative.
Yes.
Some people will then say to me, well, you probably, what about the written word? What about printing? And I'll say, yeah, there's a downside to the written word. You got to remember, Socrates thought writing things down was going to corrupt people, that you would lose the human interaction that came from oral cultures. So,
yep.
I want to
and
note
we
that
haven't even begun to get into the world, the virtual reality world and the metaverse that is coming to immerse ourselves into entirely different ways. I'm not sure that we are quite as mature as a species to be able to deal with that.
Right. So when people say, well, listen, you're just I've been called hysterical many times.
I have a feeling that people are calling you hysterical from a control reason, from an actual, from an actual. So that's not something that we would describe.
But I do think that it's important to recognize that when a person, or a movement, more importantly, because this is never the product of one person, right? These are movements of people. When movements challenge the fundamental relationships of power, right? And the critique of pornography, as well as the critique of prostitution, is a challenge to the fundamental right that men claim to buy and sell objectified female bodies for sexual pleasure. And that challenge is never well received by people with power, especially people who have unearned power and privilege. Right, who at some level know that the power they wield over others is not legitimate.
Exactly.
And so in some sense, the resistance to the feminist critique of pornography shouldn't surprise us, because it's going to the basic way that men are socialized to believe they should relate to women, especially sexually. And that's taking on not a problem of the last 20 years or the last 50 years. That's taking on a problem of the last 5,000 years.
Yes.
And so the struggle goes on. I'm so grateful that the women who are now often derided as radical feminists had the courage to do the work they did, because they were never well received by the dominant culture, and sometimes not even well received by more liberal feminists. Yet if those women didn't do that work, and I feel compelled to mention the one who was most important to me, Andrea Dworkin, a brilliant woman, a brilliant writer, whose work literally changed my life. It turned me upside down. There were a few years when I first started reading Andrea and other feminists that were difficult. I mean, I never want to suggest this is simple. Read a book, change your life. That's not the way it works. It's read a book and read another book and talk to a lot of women, and then really struggle to understand how the way you thought about what it meant to be a man is fundamentally destructive, not only to women and girls, but to you. And that was a long process. In some sense, the process never ends, right? So my pitch to men is embrace radical feminism, because it will undermine your self-image. It will cause you lots of distress, and that distress will go on at some level your entire life.
Good. Hey, I'm in. There's a sales pitch. Sign me up.
Okay, so what's the flip side of that? The flip side is there is a richer and more meaningful way to live. And just to be personal, because I think when we abstract this too much, it floats off.
No. It has to be personal. Every great transformative story I've ever heard has been personal rather than global. It has never been. It has always been from the from the I perspective.
Right. So I have my own personal history is actually pretty complex. I've lived both as straight and gay, but the majority of my life I've been in relationships with women. I've had relationships with some really wonderful, amazing, brilliant women, all of which fell apart. And I think they fell apart, personal failures were part of it, but largely because of the dynamics that are so common between men and women in patriarchy. And my story has a happy ending. I have been in a relationship with a woman now for more than 15 years that is, I think, nurturing for both of us, that is not based on some of those old assumptions about what it means to be male and female, although we bump into them all the time. We at this point, we mostly laugh about when those things come up. But I would not be in the position I'm in today in a loving, caring relationship that I can't imagine living without at this point in my life. There's no way I would have been here without radical feminism and without a lot of years of pain, a lot of years of uncertainty about who I was. But I think that's true of life in general.
Thank you.
Struggle is part of being human. And if we turn away from the struggles that are most difficult, I think we're foregoing the potential to really live at the level that makes life meaningful. I mean, I know that sounds a little philosophical and maybe even naive, but that's my experience. I wouldn't be in the place I am today if not for a lot of struggle and a lot of pain. And the other thing I want to mention is that it was not only the work of a lot of women, some whom I knew personally, some whom I only knew through their writing, that helped me. It was a few key men, including one man in particular who modeled for me how to be a responsible man within feminism, a man who became my best friend, sadly passed a few years ago. But it's not just that we learn from women, we learn from other men who have gone before us. But you can't learn from anybody if you don't open up to this. And that's the message if I had to reduce this to one message, it's whenever you feel scared, open up, don't close down. It's a simple rule maybe, but I think I haven't always done it in my life. Sometimes I've been scared and retreated. But if the moment you're scared, you can try to open up to what is scaring you instead of closing down and running from it. Generally good things happen for everybody.
Everything that Clay, you've taught me, Clay, everything we've learned together. This is, thank you so beautifully, Bob, for encapsulating that, because that's been our journey.
I find it really fascinating. There's two terms you're bringing up: radical feminism,
Mm-hmm.
and the big word or term out there is radical empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, radical empathy is trying to replace the word compassion.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us kind of back, is I'm in search of this compassionate male.
Yeah.
And I think you bring up
Within us. We
Within
are
us.
always looking. This is not an outside search. This is not looking for it outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard. So let me.
It takes every fucking thing I have. Bob, are you kidding? I have nothing. I better give this everything.
Yeah, what a brilliant insight on my part. But let me give you a concrete example of how it can be hard. We all have our specific experience of growing up as boys, how we're trained, and one of the things I had to come to terms with was the way not only I had been sexist, the way I had been maybe even abusive in certain situations toward women, but the way I was abused as a boy. And coming to terms with that is not easy. It's incredibly difficult, especially depending on the severity of the abuse. But then I see myself finally being able to hold abusers accountable, men who hurt me, right? And I want to hold them accountable. But I also know that they're the product of this same screwed up system. And so, I'm not a religious person, but the phrase that always comes to mind is, "There but for the grace of God go I."
Yeah.
Right? That I'm in the position I'm in, and I see men who aren't, and men who continue to hurt others, and I can condemn them, and I can criticize them, and I can, advocate for them to be held accountable. All of those are understandable. But where is that radical empathy for them?
Thank you.
And that's a tough row to hoe, because accountability and empathy can sometimes be at odds, right? That you can have empathy and still demand accountability. But in the moment when you're looking at a man who's hurt you, let's say, I'm making this very personal now, and you know the conditions under which that man was raised and why he took the road he did, right? And you feel compassion and empathy for him, yet you also know that the violence he committed, right, is unacceptable, and he has to be accountable. This is just the messiness of being human. And I think anytime we deny that complexity, and again, people love to grab onto simple solutions, and no solution to a meaningful problem is ever simple. But I still struggle with my emotional reaction to some men in the world who I both hate and feel incredible empathy for at the same time. Right? That's life.
And the holding of both of those.
Yeah.
Of holding both ideas at the same time. That's one of the things that I love about the idea of what we're talking about in a gradient, as opposed to talking about things in a black and white, on and off, zero sum. Is that I have to be able to hold both of those ideas.
Yeah. Well, I have to bring this up. Your book, The End of Patriarchy: Radical Feminism for Men, it's fascinating. It's a wonderful read. I read it right after you and I met last, and I'm going through it again.
Bob, thank you so much for both the work you're doing, but for the modeling that you're doing. Your vulnerability and your clarity, and you're digging deep into yourself rather than stepping outside of yourself and pointing out the others. You look first there, and it inspires me so much, because I can hear you so much better than were you preaching at me. You are not. You are welcoming me in. You welcome me into this journey. You invite me to a richness that is something beyond I can know is there. And that invitation and that modeling that you're bringing gives me the opportunity to step forward.
Yeah.
I have to say this, that you're talking about how messy this is and the struggles. What I see, this whole conversation in what you're describing in the path, that in itself is an act of compassion.
Yes.
Well, I'm grateful for that. Getting to a place where one can be vulnerable is not easy. I was, this has been a 30-year plus process for me when I first ran into the radical feminist critique. And I had my periods of being dogmatic and preaching. But, it's the gift of aging, is you kind of can let go of some of that.
Isn't that wonderful? Oh, what a blessing.
And you couldn't pay me to be young again. Being young is really hard. And when I see boys and young men who are modeling that traditional masculinity, I get angry, but I also get really sad. And I do want to sort of reach out to them. And something you were saying, Clay, trying to find ways to talk about this, because emotions are messy. They don't reduce to, words all the time. But the one way that I've discovered to do this comes with the distinction between heat and light. And, we'll often hear somebody say, well, that argument produced more heat than light. What they mean is it was, full of anger and emotion, but it didn't really lead to any clarity. And I started thinking about that in the realm of sexuality, because I noticed, I don't know, going back 10, 15 years now, that the language of hotness had overtaken all talk about, he's hot, she's hot, they had hot sex. I really started to get tired of this constant obsession with, are you hot, right? And it made me think of that old heat-light distinction. And it goes to something very core. What is sex for? And I think the answer to that is complex. Sex, when you're 16, sex is about exploration. It's about discovering your body. If you're in a long-term relationship, sex can be about cementing your connection to another human being. I'm not suggesting sex is one thing, but I started to think that we talk too much about heat and not enough about light. And what sex in my life, I can only speak for myself, when it's been really profound moments when I've been intimate with another person, is when it shines some sort of light both on the other person and on myself, where you learn something about yourself in that moment of vulnerability. You learn something about another person. I don't mean that sex always has to be profound, and the clouds part and the sun comes out and you realize, but there are those moments, where you see yourself more clearly. And your focus on vulnerability is really important, because that's impossible if you're not vulnerable. Yeah. The light that sex can generate is impossible if you do not open up to that. And so much of the training in traditional notions of masculinity is to deny vulnerability, to repress it. Men will police each other. When a man is vulnerable, they will get slapped down for it, right? The great fear, I think the most fearful place in human history is the male locker room, right? Where, after the game, men are, getting dressed. That's where men are most terrified, because they're most afraid of being policed. And so if we stop thinking about sex as nothing but heat, grinding on each other, and started thinking about the possibilities when we shine a light on each other, that's just, we're constantly searching for language to make sense of emotions and a psychological state that is sort of beyond words. And that's what I think we have to do. And I think you're absolutely right, both of you. We can't do it if we're not vulnerable. We will be too shut down.
Oh, thank you, Bob. With this is as fast a 55 minutes as I have spent. It is wonderful to talk. I have many more conversations I would like to be able to continue to bring on this. Clay, you have some closing thoughts?
I just thank you for being here. This is profound, and thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob, for the kindness of you giving us this time and for being part of this journey of learning with us as the three of us are on this. I love the quote from one of the Tom Robbins books. He says, life's sloppy, so eat it over the sink.
Well, thank you both. As is always the case, the older I get, the more I talk about this, I never know where the emotion is going to hit. And simply the space you created for me to think and rethink some of this, I'm very grateful for. It means a lot to me. So thank you very much. Appreciate
as it does to us. Yeah. Clay, thank you for inviting me along this journey so that I could meet Bob and be a part of this episode. And thank you, everyone who has the opportunity to be able to listen to this, to look inside themselves and join us in this search for the new compassionate male.
Check out the latest episode of In Search of the New Compassionate Male on your favorite podcast station.